Starting the Standards-Based Grading Journey, episode 478.
The 10-Minute Teacher Podcast with Vicki Davis. Every weekday, you'll learn powerful, practical ways to be a more remarkable teacher today.
Today, we're talking with Nicole Naditz. She was a 25-year teacher. Now she's program specialist in instructional technology. She was 2012 Sacramento County Teacher of the Year in California and also ACTFL's 2015 Teacher of the Year for our nation. So we're going to talk about standards-based grading, Nicole. Why is this such a challenge for so many of us teachers?
I think that comes down to a couple of different things. One, it's not the way we've been grading for so long. It's not the way most of us were graded. So it requires a complete shift in looking at what it is we're trying to communicate with our grades. And that shift isn't just for those of us in education, but also for our other stakeholders, our parents and others who will look at the grades and want to know what that grade really says about what a student knows and can do. So it just requires a very different way of thinking about grades versus racking up a set number of points, which is what so many people are accustomed to.
Well, and when you look at standards-based, which standards, and you have so many. I mean, we're all pretty used to, I think, K3, K4, K5, having those standards, and parents get used to reading that and understanding its meaningful content. But, where do you start?
I think for myself, I can speak for how a lot of people have started, and that is with the content standards and, when available, the content standards for their specific grade level. As a world language teacher, we don't do content standards by grade level, but rather by proficiency level. And so for me, it was much easier to actually start with my content standards and then even honing in further into my specific learning targets so that I could be very clear with students and parents exactly what it is that we are communicating as far as what they know and can do in the language. And if you just start with the set of points, the points don't really tell us anything specific about what our students can do in these various subject areas. You could get a B in the class, but have had C's in some of the standards, maybe even lower, have A's in others, and really have no idea of a student's strengths and challenges with regard to that particular content area, whereas standards-based grading helps address that.
So, Nicole, compare for us the difference in assessing and grading in a typical points scenario versus a standards-based scenario in terms of time and how you went about the assessment.
I guess in a traditional points scenario, what ended up happening was you would assign work. It would be practice work even, right? You would assign work for practice in theory to help the students build the skills that they would need in order to eventually be successful on the assessment. And then that work would get turned in. And most of the time, and this is of course in secondary especially, teachers give points for that work, often even deducting points if some of that work was done wrong. So the teacher is collecting the work, evaluating the work, giving points for that work, and then maybe putting some feedback on the work to help students know how to do better and give it back. But by that point, the students have already earned the points they're going to earn on it, so they aren't really reading your feedback anymore. And then it comes time to assess, and the assessments are kind of the same thing. Often they're this just assortment of exercises for which points have been assigned, and there's no connection between what the instructions in an exercise say and what the actual learning target is. At least that's what happens a lot when you look at, for example, a kind of typical chapter test. So when I made the shift over to standards-based grading, a couple of really important things happened. One of the first things that happened was students still completed practice and they still got feedback on that practice. But I changed from grading that feedback and that practice to just documenting it without points attached so that students and families know what it is we've done to prepare for forthcoming assessments, but their mistakes that they are making along the way are not, in fact, affecting their academic grade. They are truly a chance for growth, a chance for them to act on feedback without worrying about being correct with the very first practice exercise on a new topic, because if I make a mistake, I'm going to lose points. So that was one of the first changes. What also happened was when we moved to the assessments, it was really critical that lesson design, how we check for understanding within those lessons, how we practice and provide students opportunities to practice and build their skills in our learning targets. All of that has to be aligned to whatever the performance assessment is going to be of those learning targets. So you have to start with a clear understanding of what it is you're looking for and backwards plan from there. And then each activity in the assessment can be very clearly mapped to a specific learning target or content standard, not just for me, but for my students and my parents as well. And grading happens on a proficiency continuum within the skills that we are assessing, rather than just deducting any one of a random number of points, so that my grades looked like, instead of X number of points, the grades were approaching standard, meeting standard, or exceeding standard. And then another really critical piece is the reassessment piece, because if you truly do this, you actually have to provide students opportunities to get additional support with skills they're struggling in and have an opportunity to reassess when they grow and are able to show at a later date that they have now acquired the skills or the knowledge that they did not have whenever you first tried to assess it.
So, Nicole, what do schools do if they have one teacher who wants to go with standards-based assessment? Because obviously it's a different type of report card or progress report versus those that just have a numeric. How does that work?
Actually, I was in that situation. So I was in a high school with 2,000 students. There were 70 teachers, and 2 of us were doing standards-based grading. And you bring up a really good point, because it's actually not the easiest thing in the world to do, because clearly the system within which we report our grades is not going to be designed for standards-based grading. So the 2 of us who were doing it, we had to work within our student information system and online gradebook in order to kind of redesign both how it calculated the points and how it communicated that information. We had to do things like turn off the percentages so that students and families didn't see them, because since it was never designed for standards-based grading, what I ended up having to do was tell the gradebook, all right, I'm essentially using a 4-point rubric, not meeting standard, approaching standard, meeting standard, exceeding standard. And I had to tell my gradebook that if I break up a 100-point scale, because that's all the gradebook understands, I'm going to break it up into 4 equal parts. And then it's going to say, well, approaching standard is a C, meeting standard is a B, exceeding standard is an A, and it only communicates those letter grades on assessments. For practice, I was in a very fortunate situation that it doesn't sound like is true of every online gradebook. Our gradebook has a thing called a citizenship gradebook. It's a completely separate gradebook. It's reported to the parents in the same window, but it doesn't affect the academic grade. So that's where I would record and document all of our practice. And I pre-programmed it with messages that I could actually say or click on and choose, such as, based on the work that your student has submitted, I highly recommend they come in for tutoring and support before the next assessment. And I had that as like a pre-programmed message that I could select. Other teachers, if they just have a single grade book that's just academic, they would have to find a way within their grade books to be able to say that the practice is just kind of a done or not done. And hopefully they can still add comments to that so that it doesn't affect the academic grade.
Well, the good news is a lot of the SIS systems that I've been looking at lately have features for standards-based grading. So as we finish up, how does a teacher get started moving towards standards-based grading?
I am so glad you asked this, because one of the really important things is that I don't want anybody to go home and say, oh my gosh, that's it, we're doing standards-based grading tomorrow, because you're not. In my case, it actually was a shift that started with some smaller steps that I implemented probably about 2 years before I realized, oh, I'm headed for standards-based grading. And the last thing I needed to do was actually deal with the academic grade. So one of the things I started doing was drastically reducing the amount of so-called points associated with any of my practice, whether they did it at home or in class, really shifting the culture in my classroom so that they saw that the practice was very clearly designed to support their success. And therefore they were doing the practice because it was worthwhile, not because of points. Another shift was I had already begun introducing a process by which students who had struggled on an assessment could come in, sit down with me to go over the assessment and look at their strengths and challenges on it, design a work plan for their support, and have an opportunity to reassess. different assessment, same skills. Both of those things, eventually 0 points for any practice, and also the reassessment process, which has to be a process. It has to include a work plan. Students have to demonstrate that they have increased their skills before they're allowed to reassess. All of that really probably should be in place before someone flips the switch and decides to also then convert the way they report their academic grades.
Standards-based grading is really moving to the forefront, because that is one thing that will allow us to personalize learning, is having standards-based grading. And Nicole, you've kind of given us a start on our journey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. You can download the show notes and see the archive at coolcatteacher.com/podcast. Never stop learning.